Commander Rythax stood on the bridge of the Tongue of Prophet and watched the blue-green planet grow larger on the view screen, his 6 legs clicking against the metal floor in a rhythm that his crew knew meant excitement, and his mandibles opened wide in what passed for a grin among the Vascari, a species that looked like someone had taken a jackal and given it an insect's armor and 2 extra limbs. New Thessaly, he said, tasting the human word like it was something sweet. A farming colony on the edge of nowhere, with barely enough defense systems to stop a cargo shuttle, let alone a Vascari raiding cruiser. Sub-Commander Kellis stood behind him, her datapad clutched tightly in her clawed hands, and she had been trying to get his attention for the better part of an hour. But Rythax was not the kind of commander who liked hearing things he did not want to hear. And what Kellis had to say was exactly that kind of thing. "Commander," she said carefully, "bring something to your attention regarding the species on this world." "Humans," Rythax said without turning around. "Soft-skinned, slow-breeding, warm-blooded mammals who have spread across a few dozen worlds like weeds in a garden. I know what humans are, Kellis." "Then you know," Kellis said, her voice steady, but her antennae pressed flat against her skull in a gesture that meant deep anxiety, "that the Galactic Advisory Board has classified them as a Class 12 persistence predator species and has recommended 0 hostile engagement." Rythax finally turned to look at her, and the amusement in his eyes was obvious, even across species lines. Class 12. How impressive. And yet here they are, on a backwater farming world, with a militia defense grid that my sensors officer cracked in 14 minutes. Does that sound like a species I should be afraid of? Kellis opened her mouth to respond, but Rythax had already turned back to the view screen, and she knew, from long experience, that the conversation was over. So she looked down at her datapad and read the advisory one more time, the words glowing in the dim light of the bridge. Galactic Advisory Board, Species Threat Assessment. Species, Human, Homo sapiens. Classification, Class 12 Persistence Predator. Recommendation, no hostile engagement under any circumstances. Note, species displays extreme aggression when social bonds are threatened, particularly regarding offspring. Historical analysis indicates disproportionate military response to perceived threats against young. All member species are advised to exercise maximum caution. Kellis closed the file and said nothing more, because she had done her duty, and the record would show that she had warned him. And sometimes that was the best a sub-commander could do. The raid began 3 hours after local sunset, when the human settlement below had gone quiet, and the lights in most buildings had dimmed. In black shuttles that made no sound, their stealth system swallowing every vibration before it could reach human ears. Rythax had planned the operation himself, and he was proud of it. 3 teams of 20 soldiers each would hit 3 different locations and grab as many able-bodied humans as they could carry. Then they would be back aboard the Tongue of Prophet and in faster-than-light travel before the humans even understood what had happened. The first 2 teams hit residential blocks and grabbed workers and farmers who woke up to find armored aliens dragging them from their beds. And there was screaming and chaos, and a few humans fought back with fists and farming tools, which the Vascari found amusing. The third team, led by a young sergeant named Vorik, was supposed to hit a labor warehouse on the eastern edge of the settlement. But Vorik misread his navigation display and landed 400 meters off target, and instead of a warehouse full of farming equipment, he found himself standing in front of a long, low building with colorful decorations on the walls and small chairs visible through the windows. It was a school, and inside that school, because it was festival season and many parents had arranged overnight activities for their children, there were 37 human children between the ages of 4 and 14 sleeping on mats and blankets in what the humans called a sleepover. Vorik hesitated. His soldiers looked at him, and he made the decision that would change galactic history by saying 4 words into his communicator. Viable cargo, proceeding with extraction. They moved fast, The children woke to darkness and strange shapes and the smell of something alien, and there was crying and screaming, and one 14-year-old girl named Priya Kaur, who stood in front of the younger ones and shouted at the Vaskari soldiers with a fury that made Vorik take a half-step backward before he remembered that she was a child and he was wearing powered armor. The children were loaded onto the shuttle in under 8 minutes, and by the time the settlement's emergency sirens began to wail, the Vaskari were already climbing toward orbit. On the bridge of the Tongue of Prophet, Rythax received the cargo manifests from all 3 teams, and his mandibles clicked together in confusion when he read Vorik's report. "Children," he said flatly. "Yes, Commander." Vorik's voice crackled over the communicator. 37 of them. I believe them to be small-framed laborers, but they appear to be juveniles. I apologize for the error." Rythax was quiet for a long moment, and Kellis watched him from across the bridge, with her antennae pressed so flat they were nearly invisible, waiting for him to give the order to turn around and return the children before this mistake became a catastrophe. "Keep them," Rythax said, and Kellis felt something cold move through her body. "Children are easier to train, and they will fetch a good price in the Netherrock markets. Well done, Vorik." The Tongue of Prophet jumped to faster-than-light speed and vanished from the New Thessaly system, leaving behind a colony in chaos, parents who had woken to find their children gone, and an emergency beacon that was now broadcasting a signal across every human communication channel in the sector. Down on the surface, in the wreckage of the school building, a man named Arjun Kar stood perfectly still, and he was Priya's father, and the expression on his face was something that the human militia commander standing next to him had seen only once before, on the face of a woman whose child had fallen into a river, and that woman had walked into the rapids without hesitation and carried her child out with 2 broken arms, a cracked skull, and had not stopped walking until she reached the hospital. It was the kind of silence that came before someone did something that would be remembered for a very long time. Arjun Kar turned and walked into the militia command post without saying a word, and behind him the emergency beacon screamed into the void, and somewhere out in the darkness between stars the signal reached a relay station, and then another, and it spread like fire across the network of human civilization. The message was simple, and it contained only the facts. 37 children taken. Vaskari raiders confirmed. All children unaccounted for. And across human space, in offices and barracks and ships and stations, people read that message and went very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that the galaxy had learned to fear. The news reached the Galactic Forum on Station Orethane at midday cycle, and within 1 hour every ambassador in the building knew what the Vaskari had done, and within 2 hours the emergency session was called, and within 3 hours the great circular chamber was full of representatives from over 200 species, all of them talking at once in a noise that sounded like a storm made of voices. Ambassador Phyla of the Rethani Combine was the first to take the speaking platform, and she moved with the careful precision of her kind, an insectoid species with glass-like wings folded against a body of dark green chitin. And the Rethani were known across the galaxy as cold and calculating, a species that made decisions based on mathematics rather than emotion, which is why what she said next carried so much weight. "I will be brief," Phyla said, and her voice was translated into 400 languages simultaneously by the forum's systems. The Vaskari hegemony has kidnapped 37 human children from a colony world, and I stand here not to express sympathy for the humans, because the humans do not need our sympathy. I stand here to express my deep concern for every species in this chamber that has ever had any dealings with the Vaskari, because what is about to happen to them will be remembered for 1,000 years. She paused and looked around the chamber with her compound eyes that saw in every direction at once. "The Vascari have not committed an act of war," she said. "They have committed an act of suicide." The chamber erupted, and Thyla stepped down from the platform with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had said exactly what needed to be said. The next to speak was Grand Curator Orelon of the Yanthri Archive, and the Yanthri were an ancient amphibian species who had been keeping records since before most galactic civilizations had discovered fire. And Orelon was very old, even by Yanthri standards. Blue-gray skin hanging in folds around a face dominated by enormous golden eyes that had seen more history than most species would ever make. "I have been asked," Orelon said in his slow and measured way, "by several delegations to provide context on the likely human response to this event, and I am happy to do so, though I suspect many of you will not enjoy hearing it." He activated a holographic display above the speaking platform that showed a timeline stretching back thousands of years on the human homeworld. "Humans are a species defined by many traits," he said, "but there is one trait that stands above all others in terms of its impact on their behavior, and that is their relationship with their young. The bond between a human parent and a human child is not simply emotional, it is chemical and neurological, and it runs so deep that it overwrites every other instinct, including the instinct for self-preservation." He gestured to the timeline, and it lit up with markers, dozens of them, then hundreds. Every one of these markers represents an event in human history where their offspring were threatened, and the humans responded with what I can only describe as total and disproportionate violence. They have crossed oceans for their children. They have burned cities. They have invented entirely new weapons. They have marched into certain death. And they have done all of this, not as armies or governments, but as individual parents, acting on an instinct so powerful that nothing in the galaxy has ever been able to suppress it. He looked up at the chamber with his ancient golden eyes. "The Vascari have taken 37 children," he said. "I want every species in this chamber to understand what that means. It means 37 families who will not eat, who will not sleep, who will not stop until their children are home. And behind those 37 families stands a civilization of 12 billion individuals who consider an attack on any human child to be an attack on all human children. The humans have a phrase for this, and I have spent some time trying to translate it, but the closest I can manage in Galactic Common is this: Hell hath no fury like that which comes for its young." The translation system struggled with the word hell, and several species received slightly different versions of the phrase, but all of them understood the meaning, and the chamber went quiet in a way that it rarely did. After Orelon came a rapid succession of speakers, each one more alarmed than the last, and the Dravoshi ambassador formally requested that the forum issue a statement condemning the Vascari, and the Pelori ambassador seconded the motion, and the Keth ambassador went further and proposed immediate economic sanctions. But the most telling reaction came from Trade Lord Myvek of the Solani Merchant Guild, a small rodent-like being with enormous ears and nervous hands, who ran their largest independent trading network in the sector. And Myvek did not bother with speeches. He simply stood up and announced that the Solani Merchant Guild was terminating every active contract with the Vascari hegemony effective immediately, and that any Solani vessel found trading with the Vascari would lose its guild membership. Then he sent a private message to the human embassy that read, "We had nothing to do with this. Please remember that we had nothing to do with this. The Solani have always been friends of humanity. Please remember this." Through all of this, the human ambassador sat in silence, and her name was Catherine Okafor, and she was a tall woman with short gray hair and a face that revealed nothing, and she had received her instructions from Earth exactly 1 hour before the session began, and those instructions had been very short. When the chamber finally fell quiet and 200 species turned to look at her, Ambassador Okafor stood up slowly, straightened her jacket, and looked around the room with an expression that several alien journalists later described as empty in a way that was full of something terrible. "The United Nations Space Command is aware of the situation," she said, and her voice was flat and calm, and carried no emotion at all. "We thank the Forum for its concern." She turned and walked out of the chamber, without another word. In the silence that followed, Ambassador Phila leaned toward the Pelori delegate sitting next to her, and whispered, "Did you notice that she made no demands and issued no threats?" "Yes," the Pelori delegate whispered back, his feathers pressed tight against his body in a gesture of deep fear. "That is what concerns me." Behind the scenes, things were moving with a speed and coordination that would have terrified the Vascari if they had known about it. Because the United Nations Space Command had not been surprised by this event. They had planned for it. The contingency was called Operation Cradle, and it had existed in classified files for over a decade, waiting for the day that some species in the galaxy made the mistake that everyone who understood humans knew someone would eventually make. The 4th Strike Fleet received its orders and changed course. The 7th Strike Fleet broke from patrol formation and began assembling. The 12th Strike Fleet, which had been conducting exercises in deep space, went dark and vanished from every tracking system in the sector. And Marine Expeditionary Force Reaper was pulled from its training rotation and told to prepare for a combat deployment with one instruction: zero tolerance for failure, and every child comes home. On Station Orethane, a Vascari diplomatic attaché named Pelax spent the evening trying to find a single species willing to speak with him, and he walked from embassy to embassy through corridors that had always been busy and full of chatter, but were now silent whenever he approached, and every door was closed, and every screen was dark, and no one would meet his eyes. He returned to the Vascari embassy alone, and sat in the dark, and checked his messages one final time, and found that he had received exactly one communication, from an anonymous source, with no return address and no identification, and it contained a single line of text that had been translated from a human language into Vascari. "They are coming, and no one will help you, and you should not have touched the little ones." Pelax read the message 3 times, and then he did something that no Vascari diplomatic attaché had ever done in the history of the hegemony. He began writing his resignation. The cargo bay of the Tongue of Profit had been designed to hold mineral ore and stolen goods, not living beings, and certainly not 37 human children, who ranged in age from 4 years old to 14. And the Vascari had thrown some blankets on the floor and installed a basic water dispenser, and considered this sufficient, because to the Vascari, captives were cargo, and cargo did not require comfort. Priya Carr sat with her back against the cold metal wall, and counted heads for the 4th time since they had been thrown into this room. And the number was always the same, 37, and she knew every single one of them, because New Thessaly was not a large colony, and the school was the only one in the settlement. And these were kids she had grown up with, kids she had babysat, kids whose parents were friends with her parents. The youngest was a girl named Lena, who was 4 years old, and who had not stopped crying since the aliens had taken them. Pulled Lena into her lap, and wrapped a blanket around her, and rocked her gently, and whispered that everything was going to be okay. And she did not know if that was true, but she knew that someone had to say it. The second oldest was a boy named Daisuke, who was 13, and who had a bruise on his face from where a Vascari soldier had struck him when he tried to fight back. And Daisuke was angry in the way that 13-year-old boys are angry, which is to say completely and without any sense of proportion. And Priya had to talk to him quietly for 10 minutes before he stopped trying to kick the door. "Listen to me," she told him, her voice low enough that the Vascari guards outside could not hear. "We cannot fight them, not yet, not like this, but we can be smart, and we can stay together, and we can wait." "Wait for what?" Daisuke said, and his voice cracked, the way voices do when someone is trying very hard not to cry. "For the grown-ups," said a small voice from behind them, and they turned to see Marco, who was 6 years old and had large brown eyes and a gap where his front teeth used to be. The grown-ups are coming. They always come. Priya looked at Marco and felt something in her chest that was both pain and pride at the same time. And she reached out and put her hand on his head and said, "That is right, Marco. The grown-ups always come." She organized them within the first hour. The older children were each assigned a group of younger ones to watch over, and they established a sleeping rotation so that someone was always awake and watching the door. And Priya made them all drink water from the dispenser, even though it tasted metallic and strange, because she remembered her father telling her once that in any survival situation, the first thing you do is make sure you have water. Her father, she tried not to think about him, because thinking about him made her eyes burn, and she could not afford to cry. Not when 20 kids, under the age of 10, were looking at her like she had all the answers. On the second day, the Vaskari guards began to notice that something was wrong with their captives, or rather, something was wrong with the way their captives were behaving, because the Vaskari had taken prisoners from dozens of species over the years, and they all followed the same pattern: panic, then despair, then submission. And these human children were not following the pattern at all. They sang. It started with Priya teaching the little ones a song to calm them down at bedtime, a simple melody about stars and home. And then the other children joined in, and within a day, they were singing together in unison, 37 voices blending into a sound that echoed through the cargo bay and down the corridors of the ship. The Vaskari guards found this deeply unsettling, because to a species that communicated primarily through clicks and chemical signals, the sound of coordinated vocalization suggested hive mind behavior, and the guards began filing reports that used words like synchronized and coordinated group consciousness and potentially dangerous collective behavior. Guard Commander Threll read these reports and dismissed them as paranoia, but he also doubled the guard rotation, just in case. On the third day, 10-year-old Tomoko Hayashi began her campaign of quiet sabotage, and Tomoko was the kind of child that adults described as too clever for her own good, which really meant that she was smarter than most of the adults around her, and everyone knew it. And she had spent the first 2 days watching the Vaskari guards very carefully through the gaps in the cargo bay door. She had memorized their patrol schedule within 6 hours. She had figured out the mechanism of the door lock by watching the guards open it, and she had noticed that the ventilation grate in the corner of the cargo bay was held in place by 4 bolts that were slightly different from the ones used in the rest of the ship, which meant it had been installed recently and probably not very well. On the third night, using a thin piece of metal that she had pried from the edge of the water dispenser, Tomoko removed the ventilation grate and crawled into the duct, and found herself in the maintenance space between the outer hull and the inner walls of the ship. And she followed the ductwork until she found a junction box that controlled the atmospheric processing for the entire forward section. And she did not know exactly what all the components did, but she knew enough basic engineering from school to recognize a filtration unit when she saw one. She removed 3 small components and rearranged 2 others, and then crawled back to the cargo bay and replaced the grate and told no one except Priya what she had done. By the next morning, the forward section of the Tongue of Prophet smelled like something had died inside the walls. Engineers spent 8 hours trying to find the source of the problem and failed. And Commander Rythax was furious and ordered them to fix it immediately. And they could not fix it because they did not know that a 10-year-old human girl had quietly rearranged their air filtration system using a piece of stolen metal and a basic understanding of how air moves through tubes. On the 5th day, the children had developed a tap code communication system that allowed them to send messages through the walls to each other, even when the Vaskari separated them into smaller groups for feeding. And the older children had mapped the layout of the ship as best they could from the sounds they heard through the walls and the glimpses they caught through doorways. And Daisuke had identified the location of the shuttle bay, by counting the number of steps the guards took when they walked in different directions. Guard Commander Thrill wrote his final report on the human children on the 6th day, and it was the most honest thing he had ever written in his career. "The small humans do not behave as captives," he wrote. "They behave as though they are waiting for something. They are organized and calm, and they watch us with eyes that do not look afraid. They look patient. And I do not know what they are waiting for, but I am certain that when it arrives, I do not want to be standing between it and them. I formally request a transfer to a different posting. This is deeply concerning." Meanwhile, Commander Rythax had brought the Tongue of Prophet to the Netherrack slave station, a massive structure built into an asteroid on the lawless fringe of the sector. And the Netherrack were a crustacean species who ran the largest slave market in 4 systems, and who did not care about laws or morality or anything except profit. Or at least, that is what Rythax had always believed. The station master was a huge creature named Brock, whose shell was scarred from decades of deals. Gone wrong. And when Rythax transmitted his cargo manifest and requested a docking berth, Brock's response came back in under 30 seconds. "Are you insane?" Brock said, and his voice was a deep rumble that translated poorly, but the meaning was clear. "I have received 47 messages in the last 2 days from species I have never even heard of, all telling me that if I have anything to do with those human children, I will regret it in ways that I cannot imagine. Do you know what follows those children, Rythax? The entire human war machine follows those children. I will not have human warships within 100 light-years of my station. Leave now, and do not contact me again." Rythax stared at the blank communication screen for a long time after Brock disconnected. And then he tried 6 other buyers and received 6 variations of the same response. "No, absolutely not. Are you trying to get us all killed?" He contacted Vaskar Prime and requested guidance from the High Command, and the response he received was not guidance, but rather a detailed description of everything that had gone wrong since his raid. The trade embargoes, the diplomatic isolation, the fact that 3 Vaskari colony worlds had reported detecting human stealth ships sitting at the edge of their systems, doing nothing except existing, which was somehow worse than if they had been shooting. The High Command ordered him to return the children immediately. Rythax refused, because returning them would be admitting that he had made a mistake, and Rythax had never admitted to a mistake in his life. And he told the High Command that the children were leverage, and that he would use them to negotiate favorable terms with the humans. Sub-Commander Kellis listened to this conversation from her station on the bridge, and then she quietly opened a new file on her personal datapad and began writing a detailed account of everything that had happened since the raid. Warning she had given, and every order she had been given, because Kellis was not a fool, and she knew exactly how this was going to end, and she wanted the record to be clear about who had tried to stop it. That night, the Tongue of Prophet's long-range sensors detected something at the edge of Vaskari space, a massive faster-than-light signature that was moving toward them with the steady inevitability of a tide. The sensor operator counted the ships, and then counted them again, and then counted them a 3rd time, because the number could not possibly be correct. 312 warships. The operator sent a priority alert to Commander Rythax with shaking hands, and in the cargo bay, 37 human children slept peacefully for the first time in a week, because somewhere deep in their bones they could feel it. Admiral Constance Way stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Inevitable and watched the stars stretch and snap as the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel into Vaskari space. And she was 60 years old with silver hair cut short, and a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than stone, and her hands were clasped behind her back in the posture of a woman who had commanded warships for 35 years and had never once lost a battle she intended to win. She had a personal stake in this operation that she had disclosed to her superiors, and that they had considered carefully before deciding to let her keep command. Because her granddaughter Sophia was 8 years old, and she was one of the 37 children aboard the Vascari ship. And when the UNSC High Command had asked Admiral Wei if her personal connection would compromise her judgment, she had looked at them with those gray eyes and said, "It will not compromise my judgment. It will focus it." Around the inevitable, 311 other warships materialized from faster-than-light travel, in a formation so precise that it looked rehearsed. And it had been rehearsed, because Operation Cradle was not something the UNSC had thrown together in a week of panic. It was a plan that had existed for over a decade, updated every quarter, war-gamed every year, waiting in the files for the day that someone in the galaxy made this particular mistake. The fleet arranged itself into 3 battle groups with the practiced ease of a species that had been fighting wars since before it learned to write. And the inevitable sat at the center of the formation like the heart of something vast and patient and very angry. "Communications," Admiral Wei said, and her voice was calm in the way that deep water is calm. "Open a channel on all Vascari frequencies, military and civilian. I want every Vascari with a receiver to hear this." "Channel open, Admiral." Did not clear her throat. She did not pause for dramatic effect. She simply spoke. "This is Admiral Constance Wei of the United Nations Space Command. You have taken 37 of our children. You will return every single one of them alive and unharmed within 6 standard hours. For every child harmed, a Vascari world will burn. This is not a negotiation. This is not a threat. This is a statement of what will happen. Your 6 hours begin now." She nodded to the communications officer, who closed the channel, and then she sat down in her command chair and folded her hands in her lap and waited. The Vascari response came 20 minutes later, not from Commander Rythax, but from Admiral Gorath, who commanded the Vascari defensive fleet of 90 warships that had been scrambled to intercept the human force. And Gorath was considered the finest military commander in the Vascari hegemony, which meant that he had won several engagements against poorly armed merchant convoys, and one skirmish with a Pellery border patrol that had consisted mostly of both sides running away from each other. Gorath opened a communication channel and delivered a speech about Vascari honor and sovereignty, and the right of the hegemony to do as it pleased within its own sphere of influence, and he warned the humans that any incursion into Vascari space would be met with the full force of the Vascari military. And he ended by telling Admiral Wei that she was outnumbered in courage, if not in ships. Admiral Wei listened to the entire speech without expression, and when it was finished, she said, "You now have 5 hours and 40 minutes. Gorath fired first. His fleet launched a coordinated missile barrage that was, by Vascari standards, overwhelming. 4,000 missiles streaking across the void toward the human formation in a wave of light and fire that would have destroyed any fleet the Vascari had ever faced. Activated, and the missiles went blind. Every single one of them. 4,000 warheads suddenly unable to find their targets, spinning in confused circles before their fuel ran out, and they became nothing more than very expensive pieces of floating metal. Then the humans fired back. Admiral Wei had given specific orders. Disable. Do not destroy. She wanted the Vascari fleet alive, because dead ships could not surrender, and surrendered ships could not tell other Vascari ships to stand down. And so the human weapons targeted engines and weapon systems with a precision that the Vascari had not believed possible. Ship after ship went dark, as their power systems were cut apart by focused energy beams that hit exactly where they were aimed, and nowhere else. And Gorath watched from his flagship as his fleet was taken apart around him with the casual efficiency of someone dismantling a machine they had built themselves and knew every piece of. Their crews, driven by panic or pride, or some combination of both, broke formation and accelerated toward the inevitable on a collision course. and Admiral Way watched them come and said, one word. Enough. The three destroyers ceased to exist, not in an explosion, but in a flash of light so brief and so complete that there was nothing left afterward. No debris, no wreckage, no bodies. Just empty space where three ships and their crews had been a moment before. The battle had lasted 11 minutes. The remaining Vascari ships transmitted their surrender, and Gorath sat in his command chair on his darkened flagship and stared at his view screen and tried to understand what had just happened to him. And he could not understand it, because nothing in his training or his experience had prepared him for the simple truth that he had just witnessed, which was that the humans had not been fighting a battle, they had been making a point. While the fleet engagement held, every Vascari eye and sensor in the system, something else was happening much closer to the tongue of prophet. Marine Expeditionary Force Reaper had arrived. They came in boarding craft that were painted black and carried no running lights and made no transmissions, and they attached to the hull of the tongue of prophet in 7 locations simultaneously. And the hull breaches were so fast and so synchronized that the Vascari crew did not have time to seal a single bulkhead before human marines were inside the ship. Sergeant Mateo Reyes was the first through the breach on the port side, and he was a large man with dark eyes and steady hands. And he moved through the corridors of the Vascari ship with the kind of calm efficiency that came from years of training and a very specific kind of motivation, because his niece Sophia was among the 37 children, and he had volunteered for this mission within 30 seconds of hearing about it. The Vascari guards were elite soldiers by the standards of their species, which meant that they were well-armored and well-armed and had been trained to fight in close quarters, and under normal circumstances they would have been formidable opponents. These were not normal circumstances. Sergeant Reyes and his squad cleared the first corridor in under a minute, and the Vascari guards fought hard, but they were fighting against something they had never encountered before. Human beings who were angry in a way that went beyond emotion and into something mechanical, something that could not be stopped or reasoned with or frightened. The Marines moved through the ship like water through a cracked dam, filling every space, flowing around every obstacle, and the Vascari fell back and fell back again, and then stopped falling back because there was nowhere left to go. Sergeant Reyes reached the cargo bay door, and the Marine next to him placed a breaching charge, and they blew the lock, and the door opened. And Reyes went through with his weapon raised and his heart hammering, and then he stopped. Priya Kaur was standing in the middle of the cargo bay, and she was holding a Vascari shock prod in both hands like a spear, and she was standing between the door and 20 younger children who were huddled behind her, and her face was pale and exhausted and absolutely determined. And she had positioned herself so that anyone coming through that door would have to go through her first. Behind her, the other older children had formed a second line, each of them holding whatever they had managed to find as a weapon, a piece of metal piping, a broken tool, a blanket wrapped around a fist. They had been ready to fight. Reyes lowered his weapon and pulled off his helmet so she could see his face, and he said, "We are UNSC Marines. We are here to take you home." Priya looked at him for a long moment, and her hands were shaking, and the shock prod was shaking, and then she dropped it, and it clattered on the metal floor, and her composure broke for the first time in 8 days, and she said in a voice that was barely a whisper, "I told them you would come." Reyes knelt down so he was at her eye level, and he said, "We will always come." Behind Priya, a small voice said, "I told you so," and it was Marco, the 6-year-old with the gap in his teeth, talking to the 4-year-old next to him. "I told you the grown-ups would come." The Marines swept the rest of the ship and found Commander Rythax hiding in a storage compartment behind his quarters, and he had wedged himself between 2 supply crates, and he was shaking, and the Marines pulled him out and restrained him, and Rythax said nothing, because for the first time in his life, he could not think of anything to say. All 37 children were accounted for, alive. Several were dehydrated and frightened, and a few had minor injuries from the initial kidnapping, but none had been permanently harmed. Tomoko Hayashi walked up to Sergeant Reyes as the children were being escorted to the Marine shuttles, and she tugged on his sleeve and said, "I broke their air system. I made their whole ship smell bad for 3 days. I think I also accidentally broke their water recycler, because some of the guards were complaining about that too, but that might not have been me." Reyes looked down at this small girl with her serious face and her matter-of-fact tone, and he did not know whether to laugh or salute, so he did both. On the bridge of the inevitable, a communications officer reported to Admiral Wei, "Admiral, all 37 children are confirmed recovered, all alive, all aboard Marine shuttles, and en route to medical evaluation." Admiral Wei closed her eyes, and for a moment she was not an admiral. She was a grandmother, and she allowed herself 3 seconds of that before she opened her eyes again and became the admiral once more. "Inform the Vascari High Command," she said, "that we will be discussing reparations, and tell them they will not enjoy the conversation." Across the galaxy, the battle footage was transmitted and retransmitted and watched by billions of beings on thousands of worlds. And the Rathani ambassador Thyla watched it in her office on Station Orathane, and then she opened a communication channel to her government and said 6 words. "Update the threat assessment. Category 12 is insufficient." 6 months after the rescue, the galaxy was still talking about what had happened, and it had become the kind of event that divided history into before and after. And every species in the galactic community had drawn its own lessons from the incident. And almost all of those lessons boiled down to the same basic conclusion: do not touch human children. Do not think about touching human children. Do not look at human children in a way that could be misinterpreted as thinking about touching them. The Vascari hegemony still existed, which surprised nearly everyone, because most species had expected the humans to burn the Vascari worlds to ash and salt the ground behind them. And the fact that they did not do this was somehow more frightening than if they had, because it meant the humans had chosen restraint. And a species that could destroy you and chose not to was a species that wanted you to remember that it could destroy you at any time it changed its mind. The terms of the agreement were absolute and non-negotiable, and Admiral Wei had personally delivered them to the Vascari High Command in a meeting that lasted 14 minutes because there was nothing to discuss. The Vascari would abolish all slave-taking practices immediately and permanently, not just against humans, but against every species, because the humans had looked at the Vascari slave trade and decided that as long as they were here, they might as well fix the whole problem. The Vascari would pay full reparations to the colony of New Thessaly, calculated by human accountants at a figure that made the Vascari treasury minister physically ill when he read it. Commander Rythax and his senior officers would stand trial in a joint human galactic tribunal, and the humans had invited 12 other species to participate in the tribunal, which was a diplomatic masterstroke because it meant the entire galaxy had a stake in the outcome, and the Vascari could not claim the trial was biased. The UNSC would maintain permanent monitoring stations in Vascari space for the next 50 years, staffed by human personnel who would ensure compliance, and the Vascari would pay for the construction and maintenance of these stations. The Vascari High Command agreed to everything, because the alternative was the complete destruction of their civilization, and they knew it, and the humans knew they knew it, and everyone in the galaxy knew that everyone knew it. Commander Rythax was tried and convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment on a human penal colony. And during his trial, he was asked by the tribunal if he had anything to say in his defense, and he said, "I did not know." And the human judge looked at him and said, "You were told, Your own officer warned you, the Galactic Advisory Board warned you, you simply did not listen. And Rhythax had no response to that, because it was true. Sub-Commander Kellis was tried separately, and her personal logs, and the record of her warnings, were entered into evidence, and she was given a reduced sentence of 5 years, because she had surrendered willingly and provided intelligence that helped the Marines locate the children faster. And the human judge told her that her warnings had been noted, and that history would remember that she had tried to prevent what happened, even if her commander had not listened. The children came home on a bright morning in New Thessaly's spring season, and the colony held a celebration that lasted 3 days, and people came from other human worlds just to be there. And the children were carried on their parents' shoulders through streets that were lined with flowers and banners, and people who were crying and laughing at the same time. Priya Kaur was awarded the UNSC Civilian Medal of Valor in a ceremony that was broadcast across human space, and she was the youngest recipient in the history of the award. And when the reporters asked her how she had found the intelligence, they couldn't help but bring it to life. Courage to lead the other children and stand guard over them and keep them together for 8 days in captivity. She said, "I was not brave. I just remembered what my dad said. Stay together, stay human, and wait for the grown-ups." And her father was standing in the crowd when she said this, and he covered his face with his hands and wept in a way that he had not allowed himself to weep since the night she was taken. Tomoko Hayashi received an unofficial commendation from the UNSC Marine Corps Engineering Division, which was unprecedented, because she was 10 years old and a civilian. And the commendation praised her creative and effective disruption of enemy environmental systems using improvised tools and an intuitive understanding of atmospheric engineering. And Tomoko read the commendation and said, "I just took some parts out and moved some other parts around. It was not that complicated," which made the Marine engineers laugh, because they had looked at what she had done too. The Vascari ship's air system. It had in fact been quite complicated. She was also offered a full scholarship to the UNSC Naval Academy to be used when she was old enough. And she told her parents that she would definitely use it, and then asked if she could also take apart the family's water recycler to see how it worked, and her parents said no. Marco, the 6-year-old who had told everyone that the grown-ups were coming, became something of a celebrity on New Thessaly, though he did not understand why. And when people asked him how he had known the grown-ups would come, he looked at them with confusion and said, "Because that is what grown-ups do," as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. The galactic reaction to the incident was vast and lasting, and it reshaped the political landscape in ways that would take decades to fully understand. The Rathani Combine drafted what became known as the New Thessaly Protocols, a set of galactic guidelines that were adopted by 173 species within the first year, and the core of the protocols was simple. Do not engage human offspring. Do not threaten human offspring. Do not interfere with human offspring in any way. And if you encounter human offspring in distress, you should assist them immediately and contact the nearest human authority, because doing so is the single best way to ensure that humans regard your species favorably, and not assisting them is the single best way to ensure the opposite. Grand Curator Orelon of the Yanthuri Archive created a new academic course titled Pack Bonding and Parental Aggression, Understanding Humanity's Most Dangerous Trait, and it became the most enrolled course in galactic academic history within 6 months. And the waiting list grew so long that Orelon had to train 40 additional instructors, and the course textbook included a chapter called Why You Should Never Get Between a Human and Their Young, a statistical analysis of disproportionate responses that was cited in over 3,000 academic papers in its first year alone. Tradelord Mivek of the Solani Merchant Guild made an enormous fortune by rebranding the Solani as humanity's oldest and most loyal galactic friends, a claim that had absolutely no historical basis whatsoever. since the Solani had only made first contact with humans 11 years earlier. But the humans found this so funny that they went along with it, and Solani traders began stamping their goods with a human-friendly certified seal that became the most recognized trademark in the sector. Across the galaxy, a new saying entered common use among dozens of species in hundreds of languages, and the saying was, "Do not touch the younglings." It was used in contexts that went far beyond its literal meaning. It became a general phrase for, do not do the obviously stupid thing that will bring consequences down on everyone. And eventually, it was shortened to a single glyph in the Galactic Common Writing System that translated roughly as, "Are you mad?" The Vascari themselves used the phrase more than anyone else, and young Vascari who grew up in the years after the incident learned it as one of the first pieces of wisdom their parents taught them, right alongside, "Do not eat things that glow," and "Do not anger the hive queens." 1 year after the rescue, on the anniversary of the night the children were taken, the colony of New Thessaly held a quiet memorial, not a celebration, but a remembrance. And Priya Carr sat on her family's porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. And her father sat beside her, and they were quiet together, in the comfortable way that people who have survived something terrible can be quiet together. A Rithani trade ship passed overhead, its engines humming softly, and this had become a common sight because New Thessaly had transformed from a backwater farming colony into one of the busiest trade hubs in the sector, because every species in the galaxy wanted to be seen doing business with the colony that the whole galaxy had rallied behind, and no one wanted to be seen ignoring it. Priya watched the ship cross the sky and said, "Dad, do you think anyone will ever try something like that again?" Arjun Kaur looked at his daughter, and then he looked at the sky, where the alien trade ship was disappearing over the horizon, and he smiled the smile of a man who had walked into a militia command post with murder in his heart, and had gotten his daughter back, and had learned that the galaxy was both more terrible and more wonderful than he had ever imagined. "No, Priya," he said, "I do not think they will." Somewhere in the depths of the galactic datanet, on a Vascari educational archive that was accessible to students across the former hegemony, a young Vascari, whose name was not important because what mattered was what they represented, sat alone in a study chamber and read the archived records of the incident that had changed their civilization. They read Commander Rythax's logs and Subcommander Kellis's warnings and the transcripts of the Galactic Forum session and Admiral Way's message and the after-action reports from both sides. And they read it all with the careful attention of someone trying to understand how their species had made such a catastrophic mistake. At the end of the archive, they found a file that had been added later, a cultural document submitted by the Yantheri Grand Curator as a footnote to the historical record. And it contained the message that had been sent to the Vascari diplomatic attaché on Station Orithane on the night the galaxy found out what the Vascari had done. The message was one line, translated from a human language, and it read, "You should not have touched the little ones." The young Vascari closed the file and looked up at the stars that were visible through the window of the study chamber, stars that now contained human monitoring stations and human ships and human eyes that were always watching, and they shuddered the way all Vascari shuddered when they thought about what their ancestors had done and what had come of it. And then they closed the archive and went home and told their younger sibling the story, because it was a story that every Vascari child learned now, and the moral was always the same. Do not touch the younglings. The humans will come for them. They will always come.